Putin built Crimea to be untouchable. He called it a fortress. He poured billions into its bases. He filled the peninsula with air defense systems, soldiers, ships, fuel depots, command centers, and propaganda. Crimea was not just land. It was the symbol of Russia's return to power in the Black Sea. But now that symbol is cracking. The ships have already moved away. The air bases are under constant pressure. The bridges are no longer safe. Fuel is disappearing. Civilian life is being squeezed. And now, according to reports, even senior Russian command elements are preparing to leave Crimea. Not the ordinary soldiers. Not the men sitting in trenches. Not the units still expected to defend the peninsula. The commanders. And that sends one devastating message to everyone left behind. If Crimea is still a fortress, why are the people in charge trying to escape? Crimea is not an ordinary battlefield. For Putin, Crimea is personal. It is the place where Russia's 2014 annexation became the centerpiece of Kremlin propaganda. It is the land Moscow described as permanently Russian. It is the peninsula that allowed Russia to project power across the Black Sea, threaten Ukraine's southern coast, control naval movement, and anchor the Black Sea Fleet. For years, Crimea was presented as Russia's shield. From Sevastopol, Russia could command naval operations. From air bases across the peninsula, Russian aircraft could threaten Ukraine's south. From missile systems, Russia could pressure ports, shipping lanes, and civilian infrastructure. From the Kerch Bridge, Moscow could connect the peninsula directly to Russia's mainland. Crimea was supposed to be the point from which Russia controlled the Black Sea. But the entire idea depended on one assumption. Crimea had to remain supplied, connected, protected, and commanded. If the ships leave, the naval fortress weakens. If bridges are damaged, the supply fortress weakens. If fuel depots burn, the military fortress weakens. If headquarters are hit, the command fortress weakens. And if commanders themselves begin moving away, the psychological fortress collapses first. That is why the situation in Crimea matters far beyond the peninsula. Because Crimea is not only a military position, it is Putin's strongest political symbol. And when a symbol like that begins to break, the damage spreads far beyond the battlefield. After 2014, the Kremlin did not treat Crimea like a normal region. It treated it like a military platform. Russia strengthened air defenses. It expanded military infrastructure. It placed naval command in Sevastopol. It protected ports, airfields, roads, fuel depots, communication centers, and missile sites. It turned Crimea into a Black Sea stronghold designed to resist pressure from Ukraine and NATO. The message was simple. Crimea could not be taken back. Crimea could not be isolated. Crimea could not be broken. For years, this narrative worked. Russian television presented Sevastopol as a city of military glory. The Black Sea Fleet was shown as a symbol of Russian power. The Kerch Bridge became the physical proof that Crimea was tied to Russia forever. But fortresses do not survive because they look strong on a map. They survive because supplies keep moving. Because commanders keep controlling. Because soldiers keep believing. Because roads, bridges, ports, fuel, electricity, and communications continue to function. And that is exactly where Ukraine began applying pressure. Not only against the front lines. Against the system that kept Crimea alive. The first major crack was not psychological. It was physical. Over time, Ukrainian strikes and drone operations began forcing Russia to rethink how much of its Black Sea military structure could safely remain in Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet had already been pushed away from its old center of gravity. Key naval assets were no longer operating with the same freedom from Sevastopol. Military sites became vulnerable. Air bases came under repeated pressure. Fuel and logistics nodes were targeted. Command infrastructure was no longer untouchable. Then came the most dangerous kind of signal for any military force. The command structure itself began to look unsafe. Reports suggest that Russian Black Sea Fleet command elements and senior officers have been moving or preparing to move away from Sevastopol toward Novorossiysk, across the Black Sea coast. That kind of move is never just administrative. In a normal situation, Command headquarters symbolize control. They tell soldiers that leadership is present. They tell the civilian population that the state is still confident. They tell the enemy that the position will be defended. But when senior officers move their families, shift equipment, and prepare new locations away from the threatened zone, the message changes completely. To Moscow, it can be explained as relocation. To the soldiers left behind, it looks like abandonment. To Ukraine, it looks like proof that strikes are working. And to Putin, it creates a political disaster. Because Crimea was supposed to be the fortress Russia never needed to abandon. Now the question is no longer whether Crimea is important. The question is whether Russia can still command it under pressure. Crimea's greatest weakness is geography. It looks powerful because it stretches deep into the Black Sea. But that same geography makes it vulnerable. Crimea depends on connection. It depends on bridges. It depends on roads. It depends on ferries. It depends on railways. It depends on fuel deliveries. It depends on power infrastructure. It depends on secure command links across the peninsula and back to Russia. When all of those systems work, Crimea can function as a fortress. But when they are attacked one by one, the fortress becomes an island of problems. The Kerch Bridge remains one of Russia's most important lifelines. But it has already been attacked during the war, and every disruption forces Moscow to slow, inspect, reroute, or restrict movement. Even when traffic continues, the bridge no longer carries the same feeling of safety it once had. Sea movement is also risky. Ferries and port facilities can be targeted. Naval drones can threaten movement through the Black Sea and nearby waters. Ships that once operated freely now need protection, distance, and caution. Road routes through occupied southern Ukraine create another problem. They are long. They are exposed. They pass through areas where Ukrainian drones, partisans, missiles, and artillery can create pressure. Every truck that moves fuel or ammunition becomes a target. Every convoy becomes a risk. Every delay becomes a shortage somewhere else. And then there is the air option. In theory, aircraft can move commanders, equipment, and urgent cargo. But airports and air bases in Crimea have also faced repeated pressure. Air evacuation is limited, risky, and available mostly to the highest-ranking officials. So Russia faces a brutal truth. Crimea can still be held, but holding it is becoming more expensive, slower, riskier, and more psychologically damaging. Every route that once made Crimea feel connected now feels like a vulnerability. And when commanders begin moving away from the very place they are supposed to defend, the ordinary soldier sees the whole picture instantly. He does not need a briefing. He does not need a map. He understands the signal. The leaders are buying distance. Not security. Distance. Ukraine's campaign against Crimea is not random. It is not only about one bridge, one depot, one ship, or one command building. It is a system attack. Ukraine has learned that a heavily defended position does not always need to be stormed directly. It can be made harder to live in, harder to supply, harder to command, harder to repair, and harder to explain politically. That is the logic behind the pressure on Crimea. First, hit military headquarters and command infrastructure. This slows decision-making and forces command elements to relocate. Then hit fuel depots. Without fuel, trucks stop, generators stop, vehicles stop, air defense becomes harder to sustain, and civilian life begins to panic. Then hit bridges and transport routes. This slows resupply and creates bottlenecks. Then hit ferries, ports, and sea routes. This makes alternative movement risky. Then hit power nodes and industrial facilities. This creates secondary problems: repair delays, production disruption, firefighting difficulties, civilian stress, and military pressure. Then keep drones and surveillance active. Because once Russia knows that every route can be watched, every movement becomes slower. Every convoy becomes smaller. Every commander becomes more cautious. And every soldier feels more isolated. This is modern warfare. It is not only about destroying the soldier at the front. It is about destroying the system behind him until the front becomes impossible to sustain. That is the real danger for Russia in Crimea. Not that the peninsula falls in one dramatic morning. but that it becomes harder to feed, fuel, command, and defend every single week. And that slow pressure creates a vicious cycle. Strikes force commanders to move away. Command movement weakens coordination. Weaker coordination makes air defense less effective. Weaker air defense makes more strikes possible. More strikes create deeper shortages. Deeper shortages damage morale. Damaged morale forces more commanders to think about escape. This is how a fortress becomes an outpost. Not all at once. Layer by layer. In every army, morale depends on belief. Soldiers must believe that the command knows what it is doing. They must believe supplies will arrive. They must believe the position matters. They must believe they are not being sacrificed for a political illusion. Crimea is now testing all of those beliefs at once. Imagine the ordinary Russian soldier on the peninsula. He sees fuel shortages. He hears about strikes on depots. He watches transport routes become more difficult. He knows bridges and ferries are vulnerable. He understands that Ukraine is targeting the systems behind him. Then he hears that senior officers and command elements may be moving away. At that moment, the question becomes unavoidable. If the commanders are leaving, why are we staying? That question is more dangerous than a missile. Because once it spreads through a military force, discipline begins to rot. A soldier can endure danger if he believes the command is sharing the risk. He can endure hardship if he believes reinforcements are coming. He can endure shortages if he believes the position has a clear purpose. But if he believes the leadership is quietly preparing an exit while the lower ranks remain trapped, morale begins to collapse from the inside. That is why command flight is so damaging. It does not only move officers, it moves fear. It tells every unit in Crimea that the people with the best information may no longer believe the peninsula is safe. And even if Moscow describes the move as practical, defensive, or temporary, the emotional effect is already there. Soldiers do not judge by official statements. They judge by what commanders do. And if commanders are moving families and headquarters away from Crimea, the message is clear. The fortress is no longer trusted by the people who run it. The pressure on Crimea is not only military. It is civilian. Fuel shortages, transport disruption, limits on supplies, pressure on food distribution, water concerns, and damage to infrastructure all create a second battlefield inside the peninsula. A military force can sometimes hide battlefield losses. It can censor reports. It can control television. It can punish criticism. But it cannot hide empty fuel stations forever. It cannot hide long lines forever. It cannot hide missing goods forever. It cannot hide canceled tourism forever. It cannot hide the feeling that daily life is becoming unstable. Crimea depends heavily on connection to the mainland. Food, fuel, spare parts, military supplies, civilian goods, and construction materials all need routes that function reliably. When routes slow down, everything becomes more expensive and less predictable. Military convoys compete with civilian needs. Fuel for generators competes with fuel for vehicles. Repair crews need power, materials, and security. Civilians begin to panic before officials admit the scale of the problem. This is where Ukraine's strategy becomes especially dangerous for Moscow. Because every strike has more than one effect. A fuel depot strike hurts military logistics. But it also creates civilian pressure. A bridge disruption hurts troop movement. But it also affects food deliveries. A power node strike hurts military infrastructure. But it also affects daily life and repair efforts. A command relocation hurts military coordination. But it also damages public confidence. Russia is not only defending Crimea against Ukraine. It is defending the idea that Crimea is normal, stable, permanent, and safe. And that idea is becoming harder to sell. The peninsula has not fallen. But the image of Crimea as an untouchable Russian fortress has already been badly damaged. This is where the problem becomes Putin's dilemma. He has three choices. None of them are good. First, he can reinforce Crimea. But reinforcing Crimea requires soldiers, air defense systems, engineers, fuel, ammunition, and logistics. Those resources must come from somewhere else. If Moscow pulls them from Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson, or other pressured fronts, those areas weaken. If it sends more troops into Crimea without solving the supply problem, it only adds more mouths to feed and more units to fuel. More soldiers do not solve a logistics crisis. They deepen it. Second, Putin can reduce the military burden inside Crimea. But that would look like weakness. It would suggest that Ukraine's pressure is working. It would tell Russian society that the fortress is no longer secure. It would give Ukraine a major symbolic victory without a full ground assault. Third, Putin can hold the current posture and absorb the cost. But that means more resources, more risk, more pressure on bridges and supply routes, more vulnerability to drones, and more psychological damage each time a command element moves away or a depot burns. So Putin is trapped between politics and military reality. Politically, Crimea cannot be treated as expendable. Militarily, Crimea is becoming harder to sustain. Symbolically, Crimea must look invincible. Practically, it is becoming more vulnerable. This is the exact kind of equation that destroys strategic flexibility. If Putin withdraws, his myth collapses. If he stays, his resources bleed. If he reinforces, other fronts weaken. If he does nothing, Ukraine keeps tightening the pressure. That is why Crimea has become one of the Kremlin's most dangerous problems. Not because it has already fallen, but because every option carries a cost Putin does not want to pay. Crimea has not fallen. That must be clear. Russia still has soldiers on the peninsula. It still has air defense systems. It still controls key cities. It still has routes that can move limited supplies. It still has the ability to adapt, reroute, repair, and harden positions. Moscow has endured logistics pressure before. Russian forces have shown they can improvise under difficult conditions. Temporary bridges, night convoys, alternate routes, electronic warfare, and layered air defense can all slow Ukraine's campaign. So it would be premature to say Crimea is collapsing tomorrow. But it would also be wrong to ignore the direction of pressure. The important fact is not that Crimea has already fallen. The important fact is that Crimea is no longer operating like the invincible fortress Putin promised. A fortress does not move its command away from the center of danger unless the danger is real. A fortress does not depend on vulnerable routes that can be disrupted again and again. A fortress does not become stronger when its ships leave, its depots burn, its bridges are threatened, and its civilian supply system comes under pressure. Russia may still hold Crimea, but holding it is becoming harder. That is the key. Ukraine does not need to capture every street to damage Putin's Crimea narrative. It only needs to prove that the fortress can be isolated, pressured, and made expensive to defend. And that proof is already changing the war. 10 years ago, Crimea was Putin's greatest prize. It was the symbol he used to show Russia had returned as a great power. It was the naval fortress that anchored Moscow's Black Sea ambitions. It was the place the Kremlin said would remain untouchable forever. But today, that story is breaking. The Black Sea Fleet no longer has the same freedom it once had. Sevastopol no longer carries the same sense of safety. The Kerch route no longer feels untouchable. Fuel depots and infrastructure no longer feel protected. Command centers no longer feel secure. And ordinary soldiers can see that the people above them are searching for distance. Crimea has not fallen, but Putin's fortress myth has. And that may be even more dangerous for the Kremlin, because armies can sometimes survive battlefield losses. But regimes built on symbols cannot easily survive when their greatest symbol turns into their greatest vulnerability. Putin built Crimea as a fortress. Ukraine is turning it into a trap. And the commanders leaving first may be the clearest sign that the men inside the system already understand what Moscow cannot admit. The fortress is cracking. The cost is rising. And Crimea is no longer the symbol of Russian power in the Black Sea. It is becoming the place where that power is being exposed. Subscribe for more geopolitical battlefield analysis.